Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're gonna try to make sense of that awful midair collision that happened near DCA back in January.
Right.
You all sent in that NTSB preliminary report, and it's a tough read for sure. So we're here to kind of break it down with you, hopefully make things a little bit clearer.
Yeah, it's a real tragedy, obviously.
Right.
But I think what's particularly interesting about this accident is it really highlights some of the challenges and dangers that come up when you've got helicopters and airplanes trying to share the same airspace, especially around busy airports like DCA.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this case, we're talking about PSA Airlines Flight 5342.
Right.
A Bombardier CRJ700 colliding with a US Army Sikorsky UH-60L helicopter callsign PT-25. And this happened on January 29th, 2025, just before 8:48 p.m. Eastern Time. And tragically, everyone on both aircraft lost their life, all 67 people.
Yeah, and the fact that it happened over the Potomac River, just southeast of DCA, really adds another layer of complexity to the whole investigation and recovery efforts.
Oh, definitely. I mean, trying to pull wreckage out of a river is a huge undertaking.
Right.
So the NTSB report really goes into a lot of detail about, everything leading up to the collision. And it was a night with clear visibility, what pilots call visual meteorological conditions, or VMC. Flight 5342 was a regularly scheduled passenger flight from Wichita to DCA,
Right.
while that helicopter was on a training flight. And get this, they were actually using night vision goggles.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting detail because it makes you wonder how that technology, well, obviously it aids vision in the dark. Could it have also affected the crew's perception of, distance or the surrounding airspace?
Yeah, it really makes you think, could there have been any blind spots or limitations with those goggles? Something to keep in mind as we go through this. And I guess we'll see what the final report says.
Definitely.
So the report also looks at the experience levels of both crews, and it seems like they were both pretty seasoned. The captain of Flight 5342 had almost 4,000 total flight hours, with over 3,000 on that specific aircraft type. The first officer had about 2,500 total hours and almost 1,000 on the CRJ700.
Yeah, and on the helicopter side, you had an instructor pilot, a chief warrant officer too, with almost 1,000 total flight hours and about 300 hours in that specific helicopter model. The pilot who was being evaluated was a captain. He had about 450 total hours, and over 300 of those were in that same helicopter type.
So you've got two experienced crews, clear visibility.
Right.
And then, this is where the timeline gets really intense.
Okay.
The report kind of gives us a minute-by-minute account of everything leading up to that impact. And it starts with Flight 5342 beginning its initial descent.
Go.
Around 8:15 p.m., while PAT T-25 was moving south and made its first contact with the DCA tower.
So you can already see the stage being set, right? Two aircraft moving towards the same general area.
Yeah.
Flight 5342 cleared for that Mount Vernon visual runway 1 approach. Later, they were switched over to runway 33.
Right, and meanwhile, PAT T-25 is cruising along helicopter route 1, and they're making altitude callouts. But there's this little detail here that kind of jumps out at you.
Oh.
The instructor pilot and the pilot who's under evaluation, they actually reported different altitudes. They were off by 100 feet. And from what the report says, they didn't really seem to notice or discuss this discrepancy.
Huh. That's a bit of a red flag right there.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about their communication and their situational awareness in that cockpit. Like, were they relying too heavily on instruments, or was there some breakdown in cross-checking each other's readings?
Exactly. And as we move along the timeline, it gets even more concerning. Around 8:45 p.m., Flight 5342 is getting ready for landing. They disconnect the autopilot, they turn off the localizer. PAT T-25 is passing Memorial Bridge, and the controller informs them about Flight 5342 circling to runway 33.
Wait, hold on. Can you clarify what circling means in this context? I'm sure some folks listening might not be familiar with that term.
Sure. So imagine it like this. The plane is essentially in a holding pattern in the air, like a car kind of circling a block waiting for a parking spot to open up. So they're circling until runway 33 is clear for landing.
Gotcha. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
What's really interesting, though, is the report mentions that the helicopter's cockpit voice recorder might not have actually captured the word circling in that controller's transmission.
Oh, wow.
So that adds another layer of potential misunderstanding there.
Right. Like the one word that kind of describes what the airplane's maneuver is might have been missed by the helicopter crew. And at this point, they were visually aware of each other. PT-25 requested visual separation, which was granted even though they were still about 6.5 nautical miles apart.
So let me get this straight. They had eyes on each other. They requested visual separation. It was approved.
Yeah.
but they were still pretty far apart at this point. See, this is where the idea of visual separation needs a little more explanation, I think. It's not just about seeing the other aircraft right. It's about maintaining a safe distance and understanding each other's flight paths as well.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're right. It's not just about seeing a blip on the radar. So we've got these two aircraft converging, potentially some incomplete information, maybe a lack of full awareness about each other's positions. And sadly, it's only going to get more intense from here.
Yeah, this next part of the timeline is where things really start to unravel.
Oh.
We're talking about that final minute before impact, and it's just packed with all these critical events.
Right.
At 8.46 and 29 seconds, Flight 5342 gets that standard 1,000-foot automated call-out, just reminding them, hey, you're descending.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, PT-25 is passing Haines Point. That's a landmark along your helicopter route.
So you've got one descending, one navigating by landmarks.
Right.
And the clock is ticking.
Exactly. So just 32 seconds before impact, PT-25 flies past Haines Point.
Oh, okay.
Just a second later, Flight 5342 starts banking left to line up with runway 33. They were at 516 feet, moving at 133 knots. Then almost immediately, they get that 500-foot call-out. And things are getting really tight here.
Yeah.
It's like watching one of those slow-motion train wrecks where you just can't look away.
Yeah, and then the tension just goes up another notch. The controller asks PT-25 if they've got the CRJ in sight.
Oh, wow.
This is just 20 seconds before the collision, and if you listen to the air traffic control recording, you can actually hear a conflict alert going off in the background. It's really chilling.
It's like you can almost hear the urgency in the controller's voice, too.
Right. And right at that same moment, the crew of Flight 53342 gets a traffic warning from their TCAS system. That system that's supposed to prevent collisions.
Right.
They were less than a nautical mile apart. I mean, can you imagine what must be going through their minds at that point?
Oh, I can't even. And this actually brings up a really important point about technology and its limitations.
Yeah.
Because, TCAS, while it's a great tool, it's not as effective below 900 feet above ground level. Yeah. It might give you warnings, but it can't really order those strong, evasive maneuvers that it could at higher altitudes.
Yeah.
It's kind of like having a safety net with holes in it right when you need it the most.
Oh, that's not good. So even with the warnings, I mean, things are really coming to a head here. The controller instructs PIT-25 to pass behind the CRJ, but here's the thing.
What's that?
The helicopter's cockpit voice recorder, it suggests they might have missed part of that instruction, specifically the words, pass behind.
Ugh. That is a classic example of how communication breakdowns can have just devastating consequences. Because in a situation like this, every word, every fraction of a second, it all matters.
You said it. So the report then says that PIT-25 responds asking for visual separation again, which the controller approves. But crucially, the instructor pilot on the helicopter, he seems to have misinterpreted what the controller was saying. He thought they were being told to move left towards the east bank of the Potomac.
I wonder if the pressure of the situation, the evaluation, the other aircraft coming in, if all that could have contributed to that misinterpretation. It makes you think about the human element here, the role of stress and, just cognitive overload in moments like these.
That's a really good point. And it seems like that misinterpretation, that was a key factor in what happened next. Because instead of, increasing their separation, the helicopter's movement might have put them directly in the airplane's path.
Yeah, and the NTSB report, they use a phrase that really sums this all up, I think. They describe the events of those final seconds as a series of cascading missteps and miscommunications. And obviously we know those missteps had, tragic consequences.
Yeah. With only 7 seconds to impact, Flight 5342 is rolling out on final approach for runway 33. Their altitude is 344 feet. Their speed is 143 knots. A second later, they start increasing their pitch for landing. Then at 8.47 and 59 seconds, the collision occurs. Flight 5342 is at a radio altitude of 313 feet, PAT-25 at 278.
Man, it's just hard to even imagine what those last few seconds must have been like for both crews. And the aftermath, well, in the NTSB, they were able to get some video recordings of the actual collision.
Oh, wow.
The report doesn't go into much detail, but you can imagine how difficult that must have been to review knowing what we know now.
Yeah.
But the recordings did confirm that both aircraft had their lights working.
Okay.
So visibility wasn't an issue there.
It's just heartbreaking. The report talks about the airplane's violent roll and descent after impact. It's a really grim picture. And the recovery efforts, I mean, they were huge. Multiple agencies' dive teams involved. Eventually, they were able to recover the wreckage from the Potomac, took it to a secure hangar at DCA for examination. The airplane was in pieces, clear signs of impact from the helicopter's tail rotor. The helicopter itself was heavily damaged, especially the cockpit area.
It really makes you think about the forces involved in a collision like that, and the fact that both aircraft were actually equipped with, technology that's supposed to prevent these very situations is almost ironic. Flight 5342 had ADS-B out, which broadcasts its position to other aircraft in air traffic control, and TCAS, which we talked about earlier, that system that can issue alerts and avoidance maneuvers.
Right.
And PD-25 also had a transponder capable of ADS-B out, although interestingly not an autopilot. So they both had some level of collision avoidance tech, but it still happened. Which really begs the question, how did these systems interact? Were there any limitations? And how much of a role did human factors play in this whole sequence of events?
Right. And this is where the NTSB's investigation becomes even more important.
Oh, absolutely. And the report starts to dig into those questions, especially about the helicopter routes and air traffic control operations around DCA. One thing that stood out to me was that helicopter routes like the one PT-25 was flying on, they don't have those strict lateral boundaries that you find with airplanes. They're more like highways with flexible lanes, following those visual landmarks. So their exact position, it can be a little more ambiguous compared to an airplane that's on an instrument approach.
So you've got helicopters operating a little more like free-range chickens, while airplanes are on these fixed tracks, so to speak.
Exactly.
And that creates a whole different set of challenges for air traffic control.
Precisely. And in this case, the helicopter and the airplane, they were actually communicating with the tower on different frequencies. This means that the crews couldn't hear each other's transmissions, only what the controller was saying. So you can imagine how that adds yet another layer of complexity to communication and situational awareness.
Yeah, it's like trying to have a conversation with someone in another room, relying solely on a third person to relay the messages back and forth.
Right. Bound to be some confusion there. And what's even more concerning is that this wasn't an isolated incident. The NTSB actually found a pattern of near-midair collisions near DCA, with at least one TCS alert going off every month due to a helicopter being too close to an airplane. Over half of those involved helicopters potentially flying higher than they should have been, and 2/3 of them happened at night.
Wow, that's a pretty startling statistic. Definitely suggests there might be a bit of a systemic issue here.
Yeah, for sure. And the report also mentions that, DCA, it's a busy airport, with over 15,000 recorded instances of airplanes and helicopters coming within a nautical mile of each other laterally and 400 feet vertically between 2021 and 2024. So this wasn't just a fluke. It seems like a bit of a trend.
Right.
This accident, while tragic, it's kind of a wake-up call. It forces us to really examine the safety protocols, the communication procedures, the technology that's in place to manage this complex airspace.
Yeah.
And hopefully prevent future incidents.
It's a good thing the FAA took immediate action then, right? They issued a NOTAM, a notice to airmen, just 2 days after the accident. It restricted helicopter traffic over the Potomac River near DCA, with exceptions only for emergencies like, medevacs, law enforcement, presidential transport. And even then, no other civilian aircraft would be allowed in that area during those missions.
Right. And the NTSB also jumped in, issuing 2 urgent safety recommendations to the FAA in March, focusing on those helicopter routes near DCA.
Yeah.
It's clear that this accident has prompted a, serious reassessment of how this shared airspace is managed.
It sounds like a real balancing act, keeping air travel efficient, but making sure safety is the top priority, especially in such a crowded airspace. It's not an easy problem to solve.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a multifaceted issue with no easy answers. It requires a lot of collaboration, regulators, air traffic controllers, pilots. The whole aviation industry needs to work together on this.
Yeah, and this deep dive going through the NTSB report with you, it's been really eye-opening. You think about experienced crews, good visibility, all that technology designed to prevent collisions, and yet this still happened. It's a real sobering reminder that even in aviation, things can go wrong so quickly.
Yeah, and that's why these investigations are so important. They help us learn from these tragedies, understand the complex chain of events, what actually led up to the collision, and use that knowledge to improve safety for everyone.
One thing the NTSB report mentions is that they recovered 2 iPad minis from the helicopter wreckage. I'm curious, what kind of information do you think they might be able to pull from those devices? Could it give us more insight into the crew's actions leading up to the collision?
Well, that's a good question. It really depends on the condition of the iPads and what kind of data they were storing. but potentially they could contain navigation apps, flight planning information, even text messages or emails. Any little bit of information could help fill in the gaps and give us a more complete picture of what happened in that cockpit.
It's like putting together a puzzle, isn't it? Every piece, no matter how small, could be important.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that we're still just looking at a preliminary report here. The NTSB's investigation is still ongoing. And the final report will likely go even deeper into the causes and contributing factors. We may get more definitive answers about, the role of those iPads, the specifics of that communication breakdown, and maybe even recommendations for preventing similar accidents in the future.
I was thinking about the controller who was guiding these aircraft. That must have been just an incredibly traumatic experience to actually witness that collision, knowing there was nothing more they could do. I can't even imagine the impact that must have had.
Oh, absolutely. Controllers, they're the unsung heroes of aviation. They're constantly making those split-second life or death decisions, managing complex traffic flows and ensuring the safety of countless passengers and crew every day. This accident really highlights the immense pressure they're under and the potential toll these events can take.
It's something we don't always think about. The human cost of these aviation accidents, it extends way beyond those on board the aircraft.
It really does. And as we reflect on this tragedy, it's important to remember that the goal isn't to point fingers or assign blame. It's about preventing these accidents from happening again.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've explored what happened. We've talked about those contributing factors and the initial steps taken by the FAA and NTSB. But this leaves us with one really big question for you all to think about. What other steps could be taken to reduce the risk of these types of collisions, especially given the unique challenges of helicopters and airplanes sharing airspace near busy airports like DCA?
It's a tough question for sure, and it demands some really careful thought and innovative solutions. It might involve, rethinking those helicopter route structures, implementing stricter altitude restrictions, developing new technologies for enhanced low-altitude collision avoidance, or even exploring ways to just improve communication and coordination between pilots and controllers in those mixed airspace environments.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. This deep dive into the DCA collision has been both fascinating and heartbreaking. It's a reminder of just how fragile life is and the constant need for vigilance and innovation in aviation safety.
I couldn't agree more. And as we continue to push the boundaries of flight, let's never forget the lessons learned from these tragedies and always strive to make the skies a safer place for everyone. Thanks for joining us.